Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual Dirshu Mishnah Berurah share. We are holding in Mishnah Berurah Chelik Hey. We're going to be learning today Mirz Hashem Daf Kuf Mem Gimel Amid Aleph. We are in Siman Taf Kuf Yud Ches. We're in the midst of Sif Ches. So I'm going to begin the share today on the bottom line of Kuf Mem Beis Amid Beis with the beginning of Sif Ches. I'm just going to read through from the beginning. Not going to go over the Mishnah Berurah again, but just for the sake of continuity, we'll read from the beginning of the Sif. Says the Mechaber, Noitlim Eitzim, you are allowed to take wood. You're allowed to take pieces of wood, Hasmuchim Ladafne Hasukkah, that were put down adjacent to the walls of a hut. And if you remember, we said yesterday from the Mishnah Berurah, this has nothing to do with the halacha of Sukkah Shel Mitzvah. We're not necessarily talking here about a Sukkah Shel Mitzvah. We're talking about any hut. You have some kind of a shed in your backyard, and you stacked up reeds or other type of burnable material, other kind of wood next to the walls of your shack. You're allowed to use that wood to burn on Yom Tov. You're allowed to use it for burning purposes. And the Mishnah Berurah explained that what's at work over here is, since this wood is not attached to the actual walls of the hut in any way, they're not woven together, they're not attached in any way, therefore there's no problem here of stira. You're not doing the malacha of stira, you're not pulling off something off of the actual structure. So then this is kind of like stam eitzim, it's just regular old pieces of wood that are oimid lahasaka. There's something that you're allowed to use. If, on the other hand, you would have taken these reeds, let's say, and woven them into the walls of the hut, then certainly you would not be allowed to use it for hasaka on Yom Tov. It would be muktzah. Now the Ramah continues. Haga. V'hu adin, the same halacha applies. Im zarak chavilois al haschach. Let's say you have bundles of reeds. Chavilois are bundles. So you have bundles of reeds that are tied together, and you throw the bundles of reeds up on top of the roof of this hut. Im zarak chavilois al haschach. Also, you are allowed to take those chavilois, you're allowed to take down those bundles and use them for hasaka. De'enon betelois legabe haschach, because they are not bottled to the schach. Now we're going to see the understanding of this in the Mishnah Berurah momentarily, but let's just finish reading the Ramah here. And the Ramah finishes off and he says, Im daitai lahasikan, if your mindset, if the reason why you're taking it off the roof of the hut is because you want to burn it, mutar litlav misham, you're allowed to take it off of the roof and you're allowed to use it for burning. It's available for use. Says the Mishnah Berurah, a nice cut mem, which begins on the bottom of Kuf Mem Beis Amid Beis. Im zarak chavilois, hainu kanim agudim biyachad. When we speak about chavilois, we're talking about bundles of reeds. So we have reeds that were tied together to form a bundle. So the Ramah said, these are not bottled to the schach. They don't become part of the structure. We don't look at it and say, you took these bundles of reeds, you threw them up to the roof, now they're part of the roof. Now, if you remove them from the roof, it is as if you are pulling something off of the actual structure. That would be the malacha of stira, of seiser. You're breaking a structure on Yom Tov. And not only that, but since it involves the malacha of seiser, therefore, these bundles would actually be muktzah because they're part of a structure. The muktzah machmas iser. They're not available to you. You have to be over an iser in order to get them. You have to be over on the malacha of seiser. So if it was considered part of the roof, it would be aser. The Ramah is telling me, you threw bundles up there, it does not become part of the roof. Therefore, you're allowed to take it down and you're allowed to use it for burning. Says the Mishnah Berurah, cut mem aleph, the einam betelos. They do not become bottled to the roof. And now the Mishnah Berurah explains, Demidoloi hiter agudasan b'shar shehenicham al haschach. Since you did not open up the bundles before you threw them up onto the schach, loy batlinu legabe schach. They don't become bottled to the rest of the roof. Elo lahatzniam choshav elamai. We say that when you threw them up there, you just needed a place to store your bundles of reeds. So you figured the roof of the shed was a good place, and you threw them up there for storage purposes. Now, the understanding of this is, what we need to know is, the derech, the normal way that they would throw reeds up on top of a roof was they would take these bundles, open them up, and they would scatter the reeds up on top of the roof. So you didn't use a bundle and then lay bundles next to each other. No, you opened up bundles and you threw the loose reeds and spread them out on top of the roof. That was the normal derech of making a roof. So if you did that, if you opened up the bundles and threw them up on the roof, then it shows that what you're doing is you're trying to add on to your roof. If you did that, then the reeds would be bottled to the schach, and then you would not be allowed to take them down and use them for asaka on Yom Tov. But by the fact that you left the bundles together and you threw them up there, and that's not the derech of making a roof, so why did you do it? It must be you just needed a place to keep your bundles. So you threw your bundles up there. They're not bottled to the schach, therefore you're allowed to use them for asaka on Yom Tov. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. If you would throw loose reeds up on top of the schach, even if you already made a perfectly good roof, so your roof is perfectly good and it's thick enough and there's enough reeds up there, but if you took loose reeds and you threw loose reeds up on top of the schach, then betelim hakanim agav ikar schach, then those loose reeds would be bottled to the rest of the schach, and then they're not available for use on Yom Tov. Now the Mishnah Berurah points out that we see now a very clear difference between the halacha that we're learning now in the Ramah and the halacha of the walls of the hut that we learned yesterday in the Mechaber. Says the Mishnah Berurah, this is not similar to the halacha that we learned yesterday about wood that was stacked up against or next to the walls of the hut. Yesterday we said if the pieces of wood or reeds that are stacked up next to the walls of the schach are not tied to the schach, they're just loose, then they're not bottled to the walls of the schach. So you see the difference? Yesterday we said loose reeds next to the walls of the schach, next to the walls of the sukkah, are not bottled to the walls, and therefore they're available for Yom Tov use. We're saying the opposite by the schach. By the schach, we're saying if they're loose reeds and they're thrown up on top of the sukkah, then they are bottled to the schach and they're usher. So the halacha of the walls and the halacha of the schach is different. And the Mishnah Berurah explains why. He says, by the walls, the word avusim means braided or woven. We could see an example of that in Parshas Tetzaveh, when the pasuk is talking about the Meleches HaMishkan, the Big Day Kahuna, and it talks about sharsharois gavlos masei avos. It talks about the ropes, if you will, that connected the ephod and the choshen, and they were braided. Masei avos means that they were braided. Avusim over here means braided or woven. So by the walls of the sukkah, we said if you stack reeds next to the walls of the sukkah and they're loose, they're not bottled to the walls of the sukkah, since they're not woven into the walls of the sukkah. And the reason for that is because the derech of making walls is different than the derech of making schach. The derech of making walls is that if you want something to be part of the structure, to be part of the wall, you do weave it together with the other material. So by the walls, if you took reeds and you wove it into the walls, then certainly you're not allowed to take it off on Yom Tov. It's not available for Yom Tov use. But if it's loose, it is available for Yom Tov use. Because loose, it doesn't become part of the walls. Masha ein kein b'schach, and that's not that way by the schach. It's the opposite by the schach. She'ena mavusim kol ikar. The way of making schach is you never weave it together. You just throw loose stuff on top. Therefore, so if you add on more loose reeds on top, misarvim, it becomes mixed together with the rest of the schach. It's bottled to the rest of the schach. The nasim schach echad, and it all becomes one thing of schach. And now it's part of the structure, and you're not allowed to take it off. And it becomes clear from the paiskim that even when you are dealing with bundles of reeds, if you took bundles of reeds and you intentionally threw bundles of reeds on top of the hut in order to make the roof of the hut thicker, it's true, that's not the derech. Usually you open the bundles and spread them out, but you wanted to have a very, very thick roof over your hut. So you decided to take bundles and put them up and line them up together. Then if that was your intention, then it is bottled to the rest of the schach, and it's aser. Even though you didn't open it up. And then you would not be allowed to take any of those bundles off on Yom Tov because of the malacha of Seiser. Now the Mishnah Berurah sends you to the Bir Halacha Divrei Maschel Zarak Chavilos. Now in that Mishnah Berurah, I'm not going to go through it now, but the Chavetz Chaim brings down a machlokes Rishonim. He brings down a machlokes predominantly the Rashba and the Berurah in how you understand the Gemara in Be'ah and Yerushalmi that discusses this topic. And does it depend on your intention? Does it not depend on your intention? Etc. It's an interesting Bir Halacha. Now, the Ramah said, if you threw bundles on top of the schach, so then the bundles are not bottled to the schach, because that's not the derech, and therefore said the Ramah, im daitoi lahasikon, if your intention when you take the bundles off is that you want to use them for burning, then mutter litlan misham, then you're allowed to take them off and you're allowed to use them. Says the Mishnah Berurah's Katan Membeis, im daitoi lahasikon, if your intent is to burn them, perish. The explanation of this is, im roitza ata lahasikon, if right now, it doesn't mean that when you put them up, your das was, I'm putting them up so that I should have them when I need them for fuel. You see, if the Ramah meant that, if the Ramah meant that you're allowed to do this, if when you put the bundles on top of the hut, your mindset was, I'm putting them up so that they should be available for hasaka. If that's what the Ramah meant, then the implication of the Ramah would be that you need hachana, that these need to be muchan for burning use. Says the Mishnah Berurah, that's not what it means. What it means is when you put them up, you didn't put them up having intent to make a roof over your hut. You threw them up for storage. Now on Yom Tov, when you go to take it down, you're taking it down now for the purposes of hasaka. It doesn't mean that when you put it up for the purposes of having it available for hasaka, that you are making it. It means now on Yom Tov, when you take it down, you're taking it down to use it for hasaka. Let's see this inside. Pirish. The Mishnah Berurah says the explanation of this Ramah is im roitza ata lahasikon. If now you're taking it down off the roof in order to use it for fuel. But I don't need. The Ramah is not saying that yesterday when I put it up, I had to have put it up with das that I'm putting it away for hasaka. The lav muktahein. I don't need any kind of hachana over here. I would only need hachana if it was something that without the hachana would be muktzah. But over here it's not muktzah. Why is it muktzah? This is akin to what we said earlier. What we said yesterday about the wood that's stacked next to the wall of the hut, where if it's not part of the hut, so then it's stam eitzim that are oimid lahasaka. So too over here. I'll tell you the exact words. It's yesterday in Ois Katan Lamed Tes of Kuf Ben Beis Amid Beis. In my Mishnah Berurah, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 lines down into Ois Katan Lamed Tes. The Chavetz Chaim said, "Umishum muktzah gamkein loy nesru." The wood that you stack up next to the wall of the hut is not muktzah. The daita alayu meyesmoil, because since there's stam eitzim, so your mind is always, your das is always on stam eitzim im yitztarech lehem, if you're going to need them for burning. Because why not? It's not part of the structure, so you don't have to do the malach of seiser in order to get to it. So it's stam eitzim. Stam eitzim aroimid lahasaka. You don't need to be making it. So too over here. You threw the bundles up on top of the schach. We don't need you to be making it so that it's not muktzah. Minastam, it's not muktzah. It's stam eitzim that are royal lahasaka, the roimid lahasaka. Avaloy beinon shehei daiter lemeesmo. The la muktzah. B'kumoy shekasav dalael. Lidin eitzim asmuchim l'defanis. Continues the Mishnah Berurah. V'da, and you should know, the chol eitzim she'asa litlan min hasukah. Any kind of wood that is part of the structure of the sukkah, and therefore you are not allowed to remove it on Yom Tov. Bein atzei schach, whether we're dealing with wood from the top of the roof, udafanois atzmam, or the walls themselves, ubein oisan sheni toisvu alehen, or whether we're talking about individual reeds or something that you threw up on top of the schach, v'nisbatlu imohen, so that it became bottled to the schach, and now it's considered part of the structure. So any time we're talking about something that is considered halachically part of the structure of the sukkah, and therefore it's muktzah, therefore you're not allowed to use it on Yom Tov, afilu im nafla sukkah bi Yom Tov, then even if this hut collapses on Yom Tov, gamken also taltalan v'litlan, the wood is still muktzah. So you might say, the walls of the hut, I can't take a piece of wood off the wall of the hut and burn it in my oven on Yom Tov, because how can I do that? By pulling a piece of wood off, I'm performing the malacha of seiser. I can't do that. But how about if the sukkah collapses? If the sukkah collapses and now I have a pile of wood, that's not seiser if I take a piece of wood out of the pile. So maybe now I could take a piece of wood and chuck it in the oven. Says the Mishnah Berurah, no, you cannot. You wouldn't even be allowed to burn it right where it's laying. Why? Mishum muktzah, because this is all muktzah. And even if the hut was in precarious condition at the outside of Yom Tov, so that in your mind you knew that it was a very real possibility that the sukkah might collapse over Yom Tov, it's still muktzah. Nevertheless, Yom Tov, when Yom Tov came in at Ben Hashmashas, you weren't able to take that piece of wood, because it would have been the malach of stira. When we taisha nesru us, and since it was also at Ben Hashmashas when Yom Tov began, nesru l'chalayim, it remains also for the entire day. As far as using it tonight, that if it falls down, it should be available to be for use. For that, you have to look at the Bir Halacha. Okay. Now let's go to the final sif in the Siman, sif tes. Bayis shu mole peros. Let's say you have a locked house. That's a storage binyan, a storage shed, and it's full of apples. You've got a shed that's chock full of apples, but you have no way of getting in. It's all locked up. Muchanim. Bayishu mole peros muchanim. But these peros have to be apples that are muchan. So let's right away dive into the Mishnah Berurah. Let's see how Mishnah Berurah is cutting Mem Gimel. Bayishu mole peros. You have a house or a shed that's full of apples. Ritzaina loymar, and what's the case here? What does the Mechaber want to say? But this shed is completely closed up. It's sealed. It's a sealed shed, and it's full of apples. But the apples, the Mechaber said, are muchan. He said, Bayishu mali peros muchanim. It's full of muchan produce. What does that mean that it's muchan? Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut mem dal muchanim. What the Mechaber wants to say is, La Fuke, this stands in contrast to a case in Mechnisam Sham La'oitzer Lizman Rav, the Havale Muktzah. We're not talking about a storage shed where you harvested your apples and you put them into storage with the intent, I'm putting these apples into storage, I'm going to let them ripen up, and I don't want to use that case, I'm going to let them ripen up. Let's say I have a lot of apple orchards. So I have storage shed number 1, storage shed number 2, storage shed number 3, and storage shed number 4. Storage shed number 1, those are the apples that I'm going to be using now. So anything that I put into number 1 is definitely muchan. Storage shed number 4, my thought process is when I sell out from number 1 and I sell out from number 2 and I sell out from number 3, that's when I'm going to take apples from storage number 4. And I shouldn't get up to storage unit number 4 for another 2 months. So storage unit number 4 is ichnisam la'itzer lizman rav. Those apples I put in there for storage. So then I was mesiach das from those apples. Those apples are not muchan for Yom Tov use now. That's ichnisam la'itzer. According to the Mechaber, who's this l'chayra, I don't know why the Mishnah Berurah doesn't say this. It's a little bit of a puzzle to me. L'chayra, this is all according to the sheet of the Mechaber, who's machmir by muktzah. And therefore, if you have apples that you are machnis into an oitzer, you can't use them even if you have a hankering for an apple on Yom Tov and you happen to be standing next to storage unit number 4. Unless this is considered that you are makzit b'yadayim by putting it into storage unit number 4, and it's like grogeris and smukim. Maybe, I don't know. But in any case, those apples, storage unit number 4, that's not muchan. So that's why the Mechaber says over here, we're talking about a bias mali peres muchanim. We're talking about storage unit number 1, which is the storage unit that I generally take apples out when I need them now. So those apples are muchan for Yom Tov use. So they're not muktzah. The only problem is that they're in a sealed house and I have no way of getting in. So now the question is, here's the halachic question. By virtue of the fact that these apples were in a sealed storage unit when Yom Tov began, and when Yom Tov began, there was no way for me to get to the apples. Does that mean that now the apples are muktzah for the entirety of Yom Tov? I couldn't get to them when Yom Tov began. Now, theoretically, I could get to them by breaking down a wall, but I can't break down a wall. That would be the Isser of Seiser. I would have to be over on an Isser of the Malacha of Seiser. So how do we look at these apples now? Do we say that these apples were muktzah machmas Isser at the outset of Yom Tov? They were muktzah at the outset of Yom Tov because the only way I could get to them is by being over an Isser. So now they're muktzah for the entirety of Yom Tov. Is that what we say? So that's why the Mechaber says here, Bayishu moli peres muchanim v'nifchas. If you have this case where you have a storage unit that's full of produce that's muchan for Yom Tov use, but the problem is that it's locked up, v'nifchas, and now a wall breaks down, or a wall somehow pops open, an opening gets opened up in the wall cracks, and a brick falls out, so now you can stick your hand in, says the Mechaber, noitel mimakam apchas, you are allowed to stick your hand in, and you are allowed to take apples out from that opening on Yom Tov. Okay, let's see the Mishnah Berurah and see why. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Cut Mem Gimel. By Yeshua Mali Paris, your son Alayim Rabbi Yisasa Mikol Tzad. You have this sealed up storage unit, and the apples are Muchanim. Mois Cut Mem Dalad Ritzayin Loibar. What the Mechaber wants to say is La Fuke. This stands in contrast to a case in Echisam Sham Loitzel Man Rav. If we were talking about storage unit number 4, where you put in the apples for a long-term storage, and therefore they're muktzah, the Havilei muktzah. So that's not the problem over here. The problem just is that I can't get to the apples without being over an Isser. I was cutting memhe, but now what happened? V'nifchas. Now an opening opened up in the wall of the storage unit. So now am I allowed to stick in my hand? The Mechaber said, yes, you are. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Afilu b'Yom Tov. This is true even if the opening happened in the wall on Yom Tov. V'lo yamrinan, and we do not say the Kevin Shahaya ben Hashmasha Sasum, that since at the outset of Yom Tov by Ben Hashmashas, the storage unit was sealed. So there was no way that I could get an apple from the storage unit, Machmas Isser Stiras Binyan, without being over on the Isser of Seiser, and therefore maybe we should say is Katsoy L'Kula Yuma. So now maybe the apples, since they were muktzah machmas hisser at the outset of Yom Tov, maybe they should remain usher for the entirety of Yom Tov. No, we don't say that. Why don't we say that? Explains the Mishnah Berurah, de'ein zeh bechlal muktzah, because these apples are not really considered muktzah. Why? Kevan shalai haya muktzah machmas isser atzman. There's no isser involved in the apples. It's not, let's say, like the apple was still attached to the tree. If the apple was attached to the tree, then the apple was not available to you at the outset of Yom Tov because you would have to be over an Isser with the apple. You would have to pick the apple off the tree, which is a malacha. You're not allowed to pick an apple off a tree on Yom Tov. But over there, the Isser is bound up in the apple. Over here, the Isser is not bound up in the apple. The Isser is in the house. The Isser is in the storage unit. I'm not allowed to perform the malacha of Seiser on the storage unit. But I'm not performing a malacha with the apple or on the apple. So we don't look at the apple and say the apple is muktzah machmas Isser. No, the apple is a perfectly good apple. I just can't get to it without performing an Isser with the house, with the storage unit. But the apple is not muktzah machmas Isser. Continues the Mishnah Berurah says, the Lafit Tamzeh, and according to this rationale, Afilu haya habayis bari mikaidim, even if the storage unit was in perfectly good shape at the outset of Yom Tov, she'ein regilus sheyivchas me'elav, so that it wouldn't be normal for an opening to suddenly pop open in the wall. It's the last thing that I would expect to happen. Gam ken mutar litela peris. You're still allowed to take peris from it, and we don't say that. No, you are mesiach das from the peris. No, we don't say that. because the peiros are perfectly good peiros. It has nothing to do with the peiros. It's just that there happens to be a wall in the way. The chein hu adin, and the same halacha would apply. Let's say you have turnips that are buried in a bar. And a non-Jew comes on Yom Tov or on Shabbos and he digs out the bar. So now you can get to the turnips. I guess this was the normal way of storing turnips. I don't know. The turnips are not muktzah. If the guy uncovers the turnips on Yom Tov or on Shabbos, you're allowed to go get the turnips, even though the turnips were buried in the bar at the outset of Shabbos or at the outset of Yom Tov. Maybe we should say, why? I couldn't get to them at Ben Hashmashas without performing a malacha. Again, it's the same kind of case. No, we don't say that. We don't say that because the isser of digging out the bar has nothing to do with the turnips. So the turnips are not muktzah makmas isser. However, if the non-Jew comes and digs out the bar for you, then he's performing malacha for you. Then the turnips are going to be usher because you can't get the benefit of the prohibited malacha that the non-Jew did on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Even if the turnips belong to the non-Jew, usher ba'achila ubetiltel, those turnips would be usher both ba'achila and betiltel. There would be muktzah ad Motzei Shabbos v'Yom Tov until Motzei Shabbos or Motzei Yom Tov b'chtei sheyaseh, after an amount of time long enough that the guy could have gone and unburied the turnips and brought them to you. Because you can't, over there, the reason is because you can't get hana from the meleches iser that the guy performed on your behalf on Shabbos or Yom Tov. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Pesach, and for this reason we have to take great care on Pesach. Israel, when non-Jews would bring turnips for Yidden, if you know that the non-Jew opened up the bar today on Yom Tov, so you performed Meleches Isser on Yom Tov on behalf of the Yidden, then it would be Aser. We discussed this in great detail previously. Now the Chavetz Chaim says, however, you should take a look at the Biur Halacha. The Chavetz Chaim is not happy with this kula of saying that really we could go ahead and we could use these peiros, let's say, that were sealed up in the house. When an opening opened up on Yom Tov, we could stick in our hand and we could take apples. The Mishnah Berurah, the Chavetz Chaim, ultimately is not very comfortable with this kula. We should only employ this kula in a shasat chak, and in the Biur Halacha Dibra Maschil Bayishu Male Peiros. The Chavetz Chaim goes through a major machlokes rishonim over here, and he says there are many rishonim that are not happy with this kula, and they say that we shouldn't use the apples, this kula, that they're not considered muktzah machmas iser because the muktzah iser really is bound up in the storage unit. That's where you're doing the malacha of stiras binyan, but it's not bound up in the fruit. This kula is a major machlokes rishonim. And therefore, the Chavetz Chaim says we should only employ this kula in the shasat chak. You could take apples from the place where the storage unit got opened. You certainly cannot make the opening in the wall bigger, so that you should be able to get more apples. That would continue to be the malacha of Seiser. Okay, we're going to stop over here. Next time we'll pick up with Siman Tov Kuf Yud Tes. Thank you so much for joining me for limud Torah. The schus of limud HaTorah should stand ganz Klal Yisrael in good stead. The Rebbe should send Yeshuas and Refuas and Parnasa and Nechama to everybody you need. Have a wonderful evening. Be well.